So here in Studio One, I've got this vocal, you can see it in green here, and I want to add a reverb, but I want to use a bus to do that. Now it's super easy to do all this in Studio One. I've got my reverb in my browser over here. I'm actually going to use a preset, so I'll click on this little arrow here so I can see the presets, and it's this one I'm going to use, AVOX. So I'll just grab that preset and I'll drag it and drop it into the sends area of the vocal. And like magic, of course, Studio One creates the bus, it puts the reverb on the bus, and it also creates the send there. Now, this is not what this tutorial is all about, but I bet 50% of you at least didn't know you could create a bus that easily. If you didn't, let me know in the comments down below by saying something like, wow, I'm learning something already. Helps the algorithm. Now back to this. Let's have a listen to this vocal with the reverb on.
I should have known it from the start. I should have.
A huge reverb, as you can hear. Now have a listen to what happens as I grab the main fader for the vocal and I drag it down.
I should have known it from the start. I should have opened up this.
So not only does the vocal get quieter, but also the reverb for the vocal gets quieter as well, even though we didn't adjust the fader for that. Now, why is that happening? Well, because when Studio One created this bus and it created the send, the default setting was for this send to be a post fader send. Now, what does that mean? Why does it affect the behavior in this way, and why would you change it to any other setting is the subject of this video. But first, this video is sponsored by DistroKid. Follow the VIP link in the description down below to get 7% off an already amazing price to distribute your music to the world. So at the beginning, we saw an example of a post fader send. The word post here meaning after. So in other words, the signal goes down through the channel, it goes through the fader section, and then after that, it's sent to the bus. Meaning that if we, for example, lower the level of the fader, it's also going to lower the level of the signal going through to the bus. So in our example, we weren't turning the level of the reverb down so much as we were sending less signal to the reverb, so it naturally got quieter. However, we can also set this up as a pre-fader send, meaning the signal will be sent to the reverb before it gets to the fader. It won't be affected by the fader. We can switch that by clicking on this little icon here, and you'll see that it turns yellow, as well as the send level turning yellow as well. So we can easily see this is a pre-fader send. So let's lower the level of the main vocal and listen to the effect of that.
I should have known it from the start. I should have opened up this heart.
Now, it's pretty easy to hear that that could be used as an effect, maybe during a song, or maybe at the end of a section you want to get all kind of dreamy, but most of the time you won't want to change the relationship between the vocal and its reverb in a mix, which is probably why the post fader setting is the kind of default value here. But just as a quick tip, in case you do want to use this kind of effect in one part of your song, but most of the time you want to maintain the relationship, here's how I would work around it. So I'll just pop my fader back. I've set this to pre-fader, so the fader is going to affect the signal. But most of the time I want to keep the relationship. So what I'll do is I'll select both of these channels, the bus and the main vocal. I'll right click and I'll add a bus for the selected channels. So this creates a new bus, which we might call, I don't know, Vox Sum, something like that. And now, even though we've got this set to pre-fader, I can use this fader over here to lower the level of the whole thing, keep the relationship like this.
I should have known it from the. I should have.
Okay. Or if in some section of the song where I want this effect, I can adjust this fader to get that effect.
I should have known it from the start. I should have.
Now, that's a little bit kind of niche, I guess. There are a couple of really sort of classic examples that are given for pre-fader sends, however. I'm going to talk about one of them in just a moment. But the second one, whilst you may see it talked about in a lot of other sort of music production videos, is kind of applicable to Studio One, but kind of not. So in this classic example of a pre-fader send, in blue I have a kick which sounds like this. Just like a heartbeat. And then in purple here, I have a synth. In fact, I'm using Lead Architect, which comes with Studio One, and that's sounding like this. Note the very simple long notes. Now what I'm going to do to make all of this happen is insert a compressor on the synth channel. So I'll go to the inserts, click on the plus button. I've recently used the PreSonus compressor. You can see it here. I'll click on that and that brings that up. Now I'm going to also load up a preset to save us some time here. So I'll go down and select this A Synth Duck preset. And the main thing to note about this is that I've got a very low threshold and a very high ratio. You can see here that this is going to seriously compress this synth. You can adjust the attack and release to taste. Now, if I don't do anything else here, the synth is going to sound like this. Much quieter because it's being compressed really aggressively. But that is not what I want to do. What I actually want to do is use the kick to trigger the compressor on this synth. So I'll go up to the sidechain area of the compressor. I'll click on this arrow to select a source, and as my source, I'll select the kick. Now you'll notice on the channel of the kick, it's created that send. And then I'm also going to click on this little icon here to make this a pre-fader send. Okay, and you'll notice on the channel, it's done that. It's turned it yellow. Okay, so I've set up my pre-fader fend. Let's do a pre-fader send, and it sounds like this. Okay, so we can kind of hear that the synth is ducking. It's lowering in volume when the kick is being played. But to finish off this little trick, if you like, what I'm going to do is grab the fader for the kick and drag it all the way down so that we can't hear it at all. And then we'll just hear the synth, which now sounds like this. Now, it's a pretty crude example. You can get some very interesting rhythmic effects if you use this technique. But of course, if we had this set to post fader, like so, we wouldn't have heard the effect at all. It would just sound like this again. And that's because the signal from that kick would not be sent through to the compressor because the fader is down at the bottom. Now, there is one more classic example that you will see in many videos on this topic. I'm going to show it to you, but then I'm going to show you a much better way of doing things in Studio One. So in this other classic example, I actually have two outputs set up on my audio interface, and you can see them over here in Studio One on the right hand side. One is my main output and the other one is called Headphones. I'll leave you to guess what that's for. Now, the idea here is that we can use our sends from each channel to send a signal through to that headphone output, and we can create a mix for the artist in their headphones. However, we don't want that mix to be affected for them if we're adjusting our faders here in our sort of a main part of our session. So that's why we would set this to pre-fader sends, so that their mix is not being affected by the overall mix, and we can tailor their mix for them here. Now, that's all very good, and you can go ahead and do that if you wish, and it's the way I guess things are done in other DAWs. However, I want to show you an alternative way in Studio One, which I think is just a little bit more elegant. So I'll just select all of those channels and I will go ahead and remove those sends in one hit, and then I'm going to go to my song options. I'll press Control full stop in Windows, that would be Command full stop on Mac, and then in the output section here you'll see my headphone output, and I'm just going to click on this little button here, Q Mix. So we'll click on that and then click on Apply, and then you'll see that this has now appeared almost like sends in every single channel in our mix. So now I can go ahead, it doesn't matter whether this is pre or post fader, because they're going to get that signal regardless of what happens with the fader here. Okay, so this is a really handy way of setting up headphone mixers in Studio One without the sort of confusion of having it amongst your other sends. Oh, by the way, if you're releasing your music to places like Spotify, Amazon, Google Play, etc., don't forget to follow the VIP link in the description down below to our sponsor, DistroKid. If you follow that link, you'll get 7% off of your first year of membership. So I think it's easy to see that most of the time, the default setting post fader sends is the most useful for your mixes. But at times, pre-faders can be useful, but you need to be aware of how they can change possibly the balance of your mix. Let me know in the comments down below if I've missed any other uses for pre-fader sends that you might be using in your mix. I'd love to hear from you on that. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Mike. I hope you're well, and I'll see you in the next video.